Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I want to thank Eric for inviting me, and Mr. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor to be here. And my topic of my talk is teamwork, the key to success. And I just like to say that last night, the teamwork showed off with that concert. Yeah. And it was a prime example of how people working together can pull off something as complicated as that show last night. So thank you, Brian, and I know you had a big part of it, all of the composers and musicians. It was a wonderful inspiration, not just a concert of entertainment. Well, teamwork was very important in Apollo. It's been touched on by a number of people in this background of our talks. And let me give you a little bit of background. I grew up in a small town in South Carolina. And when I was 12 years old, I did not go out in the backyard and say, Mama, one day I'm going to walk on the moon. Mama would have sent me to the psychiatric hospital, and I'd probably still be there. But it was a dream of mine to serve my country. And so I went to the Naval Academy and was going to be but I fell in love with airplanes. And so I had a choice back then. From the Naval Academy, you could go into the Air Force. So naval aviation or Air Force was the choice. But my senior year, I had a physical. And the doctor said, Midshipman Duke, you have astigmatism in your right eye. You don't qualify for naval aviation, but the Air Force will take you. So into the Air Force I went. And I've never regretted that decision. And I don't know how many physicals I've had since then, but nobody has ever seen astigmatism in my right eye since. So it was providential, I guess, that I get the Air Force. I was at flight school in 1957, just soloed a T-34 when Yuri Gagarin went into space. The beginning of the space age, in my opinion. And so I finished flight school, got my wings, went to Germany, 1959, and in 1959, the first astronauts were selected, Yuri Gagarin, and my timing's wrong. 59, the astronauts started being selected, and so I thought I was too young, too inexperienced. But I served 3 years in Germany. And then while I was there, 1961, Yuri Gagarin flew, and Alan Shepard flew, and Kennedy announced the Apollo program. We all hooted at him, yeah, sure, we're going to make it to the moon. 15 minutes in space, and most rockets were 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blow up rather than get into space. But the most amazing thing about it was 8 years and 2 months later, I'm sitting in mission control talking to Neil Armstrong when he landed on the moon. It was an amazing experience to be involved with Apollo. And I had the privilege of somebody mentioned a little bit ago about, I think it was Walt, that we had 9 missions to the moon, 6 landings on the moon. And I was involved in 5 of those missions. I was first off in mission control with Apollo 10. Then I was in mission control on Apollo 11, talking to Neil Armstrong and Buzz when they landed on the moon. And a very thrilling moment, of course. I've seen the space program from the mission control side, and that team, and also from the flight crew side, back up on 13 and back up on 17. And the teamwork that was necessary to recover those flights, some of them, I won't say in every case, but most of the flights, the flight was made a success by the team that was involved, not only the contractors, the mission control team, and the flight crew. And so it was very, very important that we work as a team. and everybody had to stay focused on their job. As Capcom, you had one ear listening to mission control and everything that was going on in mission control, and all the flight director and playing this orchestra of flight controllers. And then on the other ear, you were listening to the crew as they were talking, and especially in a dynamic part of the mission. And so everybody had to stay focused. And before I got put on a crew, we did go around to call on contractors and try to motivate them. But it wasn't very hard to motivate people that were working on Apollo. Their whole focus was to get a man to the moon. And so we would just say, well, hopefully I'm one of the men to get to the moon. And when I got picked for a crew back in Apollo, Chris, unlike the space shuttle suits and the suits that were in the space station, ours was custom made. So we went up to Dover, Delaware, and got fitted for our suits. And let me tell you, we had 2 zippers in that suit, and I got to know the lady that was sewing the zippers in the suit. I wanted to make sure that she knew that she had an important job. And my life depended on that. And the guys that were making the widgets, the little valves, everybody had a job. They didn't know what it was going to do on the space program and the spacecraft, but they knew if it failed, it could be somebody's life. And so everybody was focused. And I think Walt referred to it. I'd say it in my way, that I was focused, and if this thing doesn't make it, it's not going to be my fault. And I think everybody had the same feeling in the Apollo. And not only the crew, but everybody working on it. And so, being in mission control was very exciting. And that was my first exposure to the real, actually, training and involvement. Prior to that, as a non-crew member, you couldn't get into simulators, but we had geology training. I was a fighter pilot. You know, this is the whole purpose of going to the moon is picking up rocks. And so this was a rock, and that's a piece of dirt. Thanks to Jack Schmidt and others, we learned how to pick up the rocks on the moon. And so it was a teamwork of all of the geologists, all of the scientists. One of the experiments I took on the moon was a solar wind collector. Johannes Geis at the University of Bern was the principal investigator. He had those experiments on at least 5 Apollo missions. And so everybody was involved in getting this thing to make it a success. And so we worked hard. We trained hard. We had a lot of failures. In training, let me say. Because in training, the crews in the simulator in Florida, we're in mission control, and we tie them together, and we run through a real mission. Not a whole mission, of course, but if you want to practice landing, we did the landings. We probably crashed on the moon 1,000 times in training, but we landed 3,000 times. We knew how to do it, and we were focused on it as a team. And I would say we have one flight director here. I don't see Jerry Griffin. He's here somewhere. There he is. And Jerry was one of the flight directors of Apollo and on our mission. But let me back up a little bit to Apollo 10. That was my first opportunity to be Capcom. In that mission and just about every other mission, mission control saved the day. We wouldn't have, in Apollo 16, I would not have gotten to land unless mission control figured out what was wrong. And in not every other flight, but on Apollo 10, there were some problems. They figured out what was wrong. On Apollo 11, we were sitting in mission control, we were listening, and as we started down on the descent, things were in pretty good shape, but we started having communication problems, and then we started having computer problems. And when I saw the computer problem, I said, we're dead in the water. We're not going to make it. You needed the computer to land. That was one of the mission rules. But Steve Bales and Jack Garman in the back room, they knew what was wrong. They said, we're go flight. I don't even think I waited for Gene Kranz to say, your go. Tell him your go. I said, your go, Apollo Eagle. And so we continued the descent. Tension was rising in mission control, as you can imagine. First time we've attempted the moon flight, and so moon landing. And so as we started down, we began to have trajectory problems. And at 500 feet of what it was, Neil looked out and said, I can't land here apparently. And so he leveled off and flew over that landing area, which uses a lot of extra gas. And so now we're minimum fuel. And the last two calls for mission control, by the way, I'd been giving a running commentary, if you will, during the descent. And my boss, Dick Slayton, who was one of the original astronauts, was sitting to my right. To my left was Jim Lovell and then Fred Hayes. They were the backup crew. The backup crew is always in mission control to help out if they have a problem. And so on my right, I got this punch in my elbow, and I looked over, and Dick said, shut up and let them land. Yes, sir, boss. And I got quiet. And about that time, we had 60 seconds. I heard the call from the propulsion guy, 60 seconds. It meant we had 60 seconds to land, or we were going to call an abort in Apollo 11. Then I heard 30 seconds flight. I called 30 seconds. And 13 seconds later, Buzz Aldrin said, contact, engine stop. And we knew they were on the ground. And it was tremendous tension in the mission control. And so we sort of breathed a sigh of relief quietly. And a few seconds later, the calmest voice I'd ever heard, I thought, from the flight, was Neil Armstrong. Said, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. Well, I couldn't even pronounce tranquility. It came out twang. I mean, I was really excited. And I think I was in more tension and more excitement, well, not excitement, but more tension in mission control for Apollo 11 than I was when I landed on the moon on Apollo 16. And so, anyway, I responded back, Roger, twang, tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue, we're breathing again. And literally were breathing again. And so there was a little celebration, as I recall, but like Gene Kranz said, get back to work, because if we'd have sprung a leak when we landed, we'd have had to lift off right away. And there was several other events that would have caused immediate liftoff. So spacecraft looked good, and so we made a good landing. And I'm convinced if I'd have gotten to, if we as mission control had gotten to Eagle abort, it would have been, say again, Houston. We didn't read that. Neil Armstrong was going to land that spacecraft. If he'd have been 3,000 feet in the air, he probably wouldn't have made that decision, but 40 feet off the moon, he's going to land that spacecraft. Gary, I think we had 4% fuel remaining. Yeah, 4% fuel for this abort. Well, he could use that to land. So the mission control saved the day on Apollo 11. Same thing on Apollo 12. It lifted off twice. They got struck by lightning. And they lost everything in this, and all the electrical power fell off in the spacecraft. We had one battery. And so John Aaron called SCS to AUX or something like that was a call. The crew said, what is that? And but it was one little switch on the instrument panel. Alan Dean flipped it up to AUX position, which stood for auxiliary. And everything came, all the data came back up, and mission control saw it was okay, that the vehicle was still flying. If Pete Conrad had a handle in his left hand, when hit by lightning twice, he could have flipped that handle and they would have aborted that mission. But he was cool and stayed cool under pressure. And off they went and had a successful landing on the moon. As I said, I was backup crew for Apollo 13, and part of the, I was backup to Fred Hayes as the Lunar Module Pilot, and a week before launch or so, I catch the measles. Well, I mean, the NASA doctors were stunned. Kids get the measles. Astronauts don't get the measles. But I had the measles, and I exposed everybody to the measles. And both crews, except for Mattingly and me, and Mattingly had never had the measles. So they decided to jerk him off. I tell that story because they substituted Jack Swikert in for Mattingly from the backup crew. And they had a week to get ready. And if they weren't ready, they were going to abort the mission. And the teamwork showed through there in a wonderful way that one guy on the backup crew can step into that flight, and a week later their training was so common that they'd be ready to go. And so Jim Lovell told the flight we were ready to go, and off they went. And sure enough, and then 55 hours later, they had an oxygen tank explode. It went through the explosion, put a piece of shrapnel through not the other tank, but the other feed line, and it lost all its oxygen. So now we're in a spacecraft with no oxygen, which meant that we didn't have any electrical power, except for one small battery. But fortunately, we still had the lunar module. And so they manned up the lunar module. And John Young and I, and TK Mattingly, or Ken, we got into mission control about 30 minutes later. And we were there for 35 hours working to get them what we could do in the simulator and the procedures and helping with mission control to get this spacecraft in a position where it would last for 99 hours. We had a spacecraft that was built for the lunar module. It was 2 guys for 3 days. Now we got 3 guys for 4 days. How do you make it last? The oxygen, the water, the batteries, all of that had to be worked out. To be honest, I never thought we'd lose them, but it was the first 20 hours looked really grim to me. Things were running out. 20 hours or 10 hours before we got back. But mission control solved that problem. And we had a power cycle that would make it all last. And so we recovered that crew. A tremendous effort by the mission control to save that mission. Then on Apollo 16, John Young and I were in our spacecraft, and we were on the backside of the moon 1 hour before we would land on the moon, and we'd separated the spacecraft. And let me go through a couple of these slides before I finish that story. Well, we bounced on a Saturn V. That's our crew. John Young is in the middle. It was his 4th flight, 2nd on Apollo. He'd been on Apollo 10. TK or Ken Mattingly is on the left, and I'm on the right, the Lunar Module Pilot. Saturn V, you've seen those lift off last night in the special effects. It was a big rocket and shook like crazy from side to side when it ignited. And I got a little nervous. In Apollo, you can't see out the windows at this point, but they're covered over. And my heart was really pounding at liftoff, and the vibration was really intense. And I decided something wrong. But John Young said, we're go, and mission control says you're go. And later on, I asked the flight surgeon when we got back, said, what was my heartbeat at liftoff? He said, 144. And I said, wow, I was excited. Sure, you sure were. I said, what was John's? He said his was 70. So he was really cool. Of the one that was, here's our lift off from Kennedy Pad 39A. which SpaceX is using now, by the way. And a picture of, I took of the moon, the Earth, and you can see the U.S., Arctic Circle, California on the left, the Baja California Peninsula, down across Mexico and Central America. A beautiful jewel of Earth just suspended in the blackness of space. And you couldn't, of course, the sun's shining all the time, so you don't see any stars. And you just look out and you can see the moon and the Earth, and then everything else. It's like me looking into this blackness of the back of this auditorium. It was just intense. If you can make them out, the green triangles are where Apollo landed. From Apollo 11 and the Sea of Tranquility to where we landed was about if I remember, 8,000 feet difference in elevation. And Apollo 15 was the farthest north, farthest east was Apollo 17, farthest littoral, Apollo 12 was the farthest west. All scattered around the equator of the moon. And all different terrains and all different rocks, it turns out. Lunar module that we were in, and then this is looking out the left window after we landed. But let me back up just a minute here. This is our look. We just separated from Mattingly, but we were on the backside of the moon 1 hour before we were to land, and Mattingly says there's something wrong with the engine, the main engine. He had to light that engine to change his orbit. Let me tell you, that gets your attention. That's your ride home. And what's wrong with the engine, John said? He said it's shaking the spacecraft to pieces when I check out the feedback loop. And John said, don't burn. And when John says don't burn, we weren't going to get to land the next time around an hour later. We had to abort the landing. You can imagine your heart sinking to your bottom of the boots in zero gravity. Ours did. I had trained 2 years, come 250,000 miles, and there was our landing site right down there, 8 miles beneath us. And they're ready to say, come home. Well, Mission Control rose to the task. Took them 4 hours, 2 revolutions. And as we were passing out of sight on the second revolution, 4 hours behind schedule, they gave us a go for landing because they'd figured out what was wrong and how Mattingly could work around that problem. And so our landing was saved. And I think it was a big decision in Mission Control because they didn't have to have us to land. Apollo would have been a success without our landing, but it would have been terrible for us as a crew. Anyway, they made the decision that we could land. So we landed and had a successful 3 days on the moon. We practiced and practiced and practiced, of course, for the EVAs or the spacewalks. And if you, I've been asked a lot of times about, did you have any fear? And the only time I did was at the end of our stay. John and I were going to do the Moon Olympics. And so down here on Earth, I weighed 165 kilos. Up on the moon, about 27 kilos. And like Jack said yesterday, it was like bouncing on a trampoline. And I gave a big jump, and when I did, I went over backwards, and I was falling on my back. And the life support system is your life support system. And if it breaks, I'm dead. So I rolled right, broke my fall. John and I ran over and said, that wasn't very smart, Charlie. And I said, help me up, John. But my heart was pounding. And I got up and I looked over and the TV camera was pointed right at me. And my fear turned to embarrassment, really. Mission Control was very upset. And as a result of that, that ended the Moon Olympics, by the way. And so John Young and I hold a high jump record for the moon. So we lifted off and came home, and successful. You've heard about the rest of the EVAs we had coming home. Al's covered that. This was a tremendous experience being on the moon. It was wonder and awe and excitement, exhilaration, and a feeling of belonging. We recognized the major landing spots, the major landmarks in our landing site, so it was like you'd been there before. Well, here's old Stone Mountain. This is a picture out of John's window, Stone Mountain. And it was about 4 or 5 kilometers away, and we had a car like they had on Apollo 15, and we drove down there. Drove up the mountain. It was exciting being in this car and to revolutionize lunar exploration. And there were many other exciting moments on the moon. But as a result of that high jump, I learned a lesson. Was don't ever do anything in space that you hadn't practiced on Earth. And we had never practiced the high jump on the moon, in the airplane or in this harness they gave us. So it could have been life-ending for me, but it didn't. One other quick story is I have a twin brother, an identical twin brother, and on one of the EVAs, we're out on the moon exploring, and there I am bouncing around the moon, and my brother walks into mission control. So Dorothy was in the viewing room, and she said it almost brought everything to a stop. And I think that birthed the moon hoax business. That how could he be up there and here too at the same time? So anyway, it was my twin brother. So, but I felt right up to home on the moon. As I said, it's covered with dust, very, very fine, like powder, shattered with pulverized rock. Everywhere you walked, you left your footprints. So you never worried about getting lost on the moon. You just turn around and follow your tracks back. And you drove, and the tracks were everywhere up there. So it was an exciting adventure, and I could go on and on with this, but the whole purpose of this is that mission control saved the day. There's a documentary out called Mission Control, The Unsung Heroes of Apollo, and it's really true. They did save the day on almost every Apollo. I was back up to Jack Schmidt. I said, man, I'd like to go again, but he wouldn't let me get close to him so I could break his leg. And he stayed healthy, so nobody got to go more than once. So, but I'm just looking back at all of Apollo, everybody involved, and the importance of working together as a team. And when you do that, you're going to increase your chances of success by several orders of magnitude. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.